In 1965, the protests in Selma, Alabama, and March to Montgomery were one of the pivotal moments leading on the way to the voters' rights legislation for African Americans. We feel we know the famous images from that time: Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks looking out over exuberant crowds, peaceful marchers met with clubs. But there was a whole other story going on too, which Elizabeth Partridge brilliantly captures here in words and pictures. That was the story of the dramatic role that teenagers and children were playing throughout the events. In Marching for Freedom, we see how these young people face down billy clubs and jail time for their convictions, but also on a pragmatic level in place of their parents, in the thinking that that way mom or dad wouldn't lose their livelihoods, wouldn't lose their jobs because their kids were filling the jails. It was a crucial role that these young people were playing. This book provides an inspiring example to young readers today of what it means to stand up for your beliefs and have the actual possibility of changing history. Also helping tell the story, of course, in this book are unbelievable photographs, which you could look at again and again, including notably for me the cover portrait of these two young men who were high school students in Selma, whose expressions just draw us with their resoluteness of purpose. They draw us in, and the book rewards us. I'm delighted to present the 2010 Boston Globe Hornbook Award for Nonfiction to Marching for Freedom, Walk Together Children and Don't You Grow Weary, published by Viking, edited by Catherine Frank, written by Elizabeth Partridge.
Congratulations. Number two.
That's the closest I'll ever get to hefting a sports trophy. I want to thank the members of the Boston Globe Hornbook Committee, Julie Just, Gregory McGuire, and Martha Paravano. I am incredibly, deeply honored in a year of the most amazing nonfiction to be given this award. And as everybody here knows, no book springs into being like Dionysus popping out of the thigh of Zeus. I work with the most amazing people at Viking. My editor, Catherine Frank, publisher, Regina Hayes, copy editor, Janet Pascal, who's extraordinary, and designer, Jim Hoover, all of them totally extraordinary. My thanks to all of you. They're my posse sitting right there. As well as the dedicated people who worked on the book once it was firmly stuck between two covers. And I want to give huge thanks to my agent, Ken Wright, truly my wingman. Several years ago, I was browsing around online and I bumped into photographs of the 1965 Selma to Montgomery Civil Rights March by photographer Matt Herron. I wanted them. This is what I call photo lust, and I get it really bad. I immediately emailed Matt to ask if he wanted to do a book with me, after warning him, of course, that in children's books, there's not a lot of money. These are really love projects. And fortunately, he was enthusiastic about the idea and turned out to live about a half an hour away from me. So he invited me to come over and browse through his archive. And this, in Matt's case, his photo archive was a dusty room crammed full of filing cabinets that I was allowed to just make my way through. This was not one of those white gloves, quiet type places, which was wonderful. In fact, the second time I was there, he went out to do some errands with his wife and left me alone with all his photographs. I also found the work of John Phillips in Toronto. He's another of these scratchy, cranky, delightful, dedicated civil rights photographers. So since he was so far away, what he ended up doing was scanning in all his proof sheets for me to choose from. As I looked through all the photographs, and I found other ones also, I realized there were lots of kids and young adults involved in these protests, which at first puzzled me. Then I read a couple archived articles, one in the New York Times and another in the New Yorker, where the reporters had interviewed and quoted kids by name. Well, this is like a lightning strike for somebody who loves primary source materials, which I do, as much as I love photographs. I realized I could probably find a few of these kids and interview them. So I got on the internet, the telephone, and I located a handful of these kids, 5 or 6 of them, who are now sort of 55 to 65 years old. So in November 2008, I flew to Selma to interview people. They remembered the events with absolutely crystal clarity. Their stories were terrifying and inspiring. They were too young to vote, but they had had the courage to stand up for what they believed in, for what they knew was right, despite being humiliated, beaten, and repeatedly jailed. One of the people I interviewed, Bobby Simmons, for those of you that know the cover, he's the young man with "vote" written across his forehead. He was 17 at the time. He was among the first group of marchers to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge on what became known as Bloody Sunday. State troopers attacked with tear gas and billy clubs. Bobby told me how he ran forward and dodged through the troopers and was caught in a cloud of tear gas in front of several small businesses. Quote, "People were laying out, bleeding, coughing, crying," he said. "We were pure defenseless." That's just one of the most eloquent descriptive phrases in the world, pure defenseless. By chance, my visit to Selma included election night where we had no idea how the election was going to turn out? After dark, I joined a memorial candlelight vigil walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. There was just the shushing sound of our feet, and far below us the murmuring of water. Handheld cameras bobbed gently in the darkness. We walked to the site where the troopers had attacked at the far side of the bridge. 96-year-old Amelia Boynton, who'd been badly beaten there, moved to the center of the crowd. Her voice was soft, and as she spoke, we all drew in closer and closer to hear her. It was very hushed and reverential. All around me, the faces were glowing in the candlelight as we held our little candles. Suddenly, someone called out, "Obama's taken Pennsylvania!" And then we knew he would be our next president. People burst out, cheering, yelling, and crying. As I finished my research and worked on rough drafts, Obama became president. I was so excited. I thought, wow, civil rights are going to really be moved forward again as they need to be. But what I, like so many others, didn't anticipate was the just counter slam that came in like a tidal wave. By the time Marching for Freedom came out, it was apparent that a frightening backlash had been galvanized by having an African-American president. Since his election, there has been a steady increase in hate crimes, and memberships in hate groups are now at record levels. While Marching for Freedom is clearly a book about civil rights, it's fundamentally about democracy, with the cornerstone of the right to vote. And in our robust, paradoxically fragile, perpetually challenged democracy, we need to look out for one another and protect those who are vulnerable. In the strange ways of the world, I am now Facebook friends with one of the marchers, Linda Lowry. She was not the youngest person to march. She was the youngest person to march all the way from Selma to Montgomery. I was not brave, she told me. I was not courageous. I was determined. That's how I got to Montgomery. But I disagree. I thought she was very brave and very courageous. I don't know that I could have done what she did. After living in New York City for years, Linda returned to Selma to live. She has a deep and powerful spiritual practice. Here's part of a recent posting of hers. Quote, Romans 13:12 says, "The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness and let us put on the armor of light." Linda's armor of light is faith, love, and prayer. The armor of light is how the young people in Selma stood up to the brute force and unjust laws and cultural expectations and changed our democracy. The armor of light was all they had. This is a tough, tough world. How do we keep our hearts from breaking in a way we fear we can never mend? How do we acknowledge the terrifying darkness in the world and yet not give in to despair and grief? How do we honor people who have stood up against tremendous odds, against belief systems, against contradiction and confusion, and have found a way to heal and love despite the forces arrayed against them? How do we put on our armor of light? I do it by writing books. Books about courageous people, because I'm not a courageous person, so I get to stand behind them and put them out there. People who dare to believe that change is possible and are willing to work hard to make it happen. And these days, I'm heartened. We also have another record. We have a record-breaking number of kids and young adults across the United States putting their passion and time into a wide range of volunteer activities and community service. While I write about the past and how it's made us who we are today, it's the future that we can change, and these young people are doing it. They fill me with hope. Thank you.